He studied natural sciences at Cambridge and philosophy at Harvard. As a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, he was a director of studies in cell biology and was also a research fellow of the Royal Society. He worked in Hyderabad, India, as principal plant psychologist at the International Crops Research Institute for the semi-arid tropics, and also lived for 2 years in the Benedictine ashram of Farbeda Griffiths on the bank of River Koveri in Tamil Nadu. From 2005 to 2010, he was director of the Perot Warwick Project for the study of unexplained human and animal abilities, funded from Trinity College, Cambridge. He's currently a fellow of the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California, and of Schumann College in Dartington, England. He lives in London and is married to Jill Porce, with whom he has 2 sons. Okay. That's just a short biography to Rupert. It's over to you, Rupert.
Thank you, Ali. Just one point about the biography. You said I was the principal plant psychologist at the International Crops Research Institute. Unfortunately, the institute wasn't so advanced that they had plant intelligence and psychology. I was the principal plant physiologist, working out how they work. Well, it's very good to be with you. And the main theme I want to dwell on this evening is the idea of psychedelics expanding consciousness. I mean, the word literally means psyche revealing, soul revealing, or mind revealing. But they're always often being said to expand the mind. And I think that's what they do. And so I want to talk about some aspects of that. And my own experience of mind-altering substances began, I think, around, well, no, I not think it did begin in 1968. I was traveling in India on my way to Malaysia, where I was working at the botany department of the University of Malaya on tropical rainforest plants. And on my way through India, I was in Delhi. I only knew one person in India, and that was a friend of mine who was a research student at Cambridge, an anthropologist who was working with a group of Indians in a village up in the Himalayas. I hadn't arranged to meet him, but I just bumped into him. He happened to be in Delhi by chance. And he said, "Would you like to come to my village?" So I thought this would be an amazing opportunity. So I went with him. We took buses, we trundled up dusty roads. We walked several miles from the last bus stop to his remote village. There was no electricity, no TV. And he was living with a herbal Brahmin, a herbalist, a Brahmin who was a herbalist. Very simple. But he knew the local language, Pahadi. And I spent several days there, and it was just amazing to be plunged into rural India, a week after leaving Cambridge. And one of the things we did, after I'd been there 2 or 3 days, we were going for a walk along a valley, and there was a rushing torrent coming down, and there was a cave by the river. And in it, there was this orange-clad figure. And so I said to him, "Who's that?" He said, "Oh, that's the local holy man." And the holy man waved to us and invited us to visit him in his cave, which we did. And when we were there, he produced a chillum. I'd never seen one before, a clay pipe. And he asked if I'd like to smoke some of Shiva's holy plant. I didn't know what Shiva's holy plant was, but I thought, why not? Here I am in India. And so I smoked it. He showed me how. And it had an enormously powerful effect. It was very, very strong cannabis, and maybe with other things too. And this was the first time I'd taken cannabis. And I stepped out of the cave, and there I was, and the fields were green around the mountains with the snow on the top. I felt this incredible sense of connection with the land, with the place. I felt this sense of divine presence. I felt I was part of a much larger consciousness than my own. Now, at that stage, I was an atheist. I'd rejected religious belief as a teenager, like many people do. And I'd been doing scientific research and adopted the atheist materialist worldview. Nothing had prepared me for this experience. And it literally opened my mind. And the cannabis acted as a gateway drug, as we're often told it does, for me. And later, when I got back to Cambridge around 1970, a friend of mine asked if I'd like to try LSD. So I did. I think it was a very high dose. In those days, people usually took 250 micrograms. That was considered normal. It's now considered quite high. It had a hugely powerful effect upon me and opened my mind. I went through regions of terror, regions of total beauty, colors that I'd never experienced before. Music turned into beautiful shapes and forms, changing along with the music. Plants glowed radiantly and light shot out of them. Flocks of birds in the sky had sort of envelopes around them, the field of the flock I thought I was seeing. It was an enormously revelatory experience. And it opened my mind to the possibility that consciousness was far more than I'd been taught. I studied physiology as an undergraduate at Cambridge. We had lectures on the brain and on nerve impulses, and I'd studied all that. And I knew the official view was our minds are nothing but the activity of our brains. They're inside our heads, and it's all about nerve impulses and so forth. But nothing had prepared me for this. And I got very interested in the nature of consciousness as a result. I started reading philosophy of mind, particularly Hindu philosophy of mind. I took up transcendental meditation around 1971 because I got interested in exploring consciousness without drugs and finding out more about the nature of the mind from within. Later, in the 1980s, I became friends with Terence McKenna and Ralph Abraham, who I met in California. Terence was a great visionary, an expert on psychedelic shamanism. Ralph was and still is a mathematician at the University of California at Santa Cruz, particularly interested in computer graphics, a field which was enormously influenced by psychedelics, as he himself was the first to admit. And indeed, he was one of the pioneers of this whole field of computer graphics. And since then, I've had many friends who are engaged in research in this area and thought a lot about it. But all along, there's been this tremendous tension between the direct experience of these substances and the official scientific view. Many people just don't bother with the official scientific view, but I have to. I'm a scientist. I write papers and do research and publish things in peer-reviewed journals and hang out with a lot of scientists. And the official scientific view of the mind, as I mentioned, is the materialist view. The mind is nothing but the activity of the brain. Consciousness is a kind of phosphorescence around the nerve endings, or a reality, a virtual reality display produced inside the head. Or in the words of Anil Seth in his new book, it's a controlled hallucination, that our brains produce a controlled hallucination and it's all inside the head. Now, I found that incredibly implausible. And yet, it's still the official view. It's still what's taught in our schools and universities. It's still the basis of 99.9% of research in psychology and cognitive science and in official view and in medicine and official views of the brain. It's all supposed to be inside the head. Well, I don't think it is. And one of the consequences of my own experiences was to try and explore how scientifically we could think of the mind as being more extensive than the brain, how we can think of the mind as being expanded or extended. I think that the first point is that in just normal experience, like now, everyday experience, as you see things around you, I'm seeing my room around me, the computer screen in front of me, and so on, that the official view is that light comes into the eyes, there are inverted images on the retina, changes in the optic nerve, and changes in various regions of the brain, the visual cortex and other parts of the brain. Well, all that's true, and it's very good as far as it goes. But the trouble is that discovering that there are changes in the brain when you see things and showing through brain scans where they are in greater detail than ever before doesn't actually explain vision. It doesn't explain, first of all, why you're conscious at all. And secondly, it doesn't explain why you're seeing things outside your head, not inside your head, where these images are supposed to be. You're meant to have representations inside the brain, a copy of the external world. Everything you're seeing around you now is a copy inside the brain of what's out there. That's the official view. And yet, that's not how it actually feels. And nobody's ever seen a virtual reality display inside a brain, even in open brain surgery. People don't see virtual three-dimensional full-color virtual reality displays inside the brain. I think what's going on is that when we see things, not only do images come in through the retinas and impulses up the optic nerve and changes in the brain, but we also project out the visual images. So I think everything I'm seeing, the images I'm seeing, are not inside my brain. They're exactly where they seem to be. Your image of me on your computer or telephone screen is exactly where it seems to be, not inside your brain. It's in your mind, but not inside your head. I got interested in this more extended view of the mind just in ordinary everyday perception. And when I discuss it with colleagues, then they'd say, oh, well, that's just an interpretation. I mean, how could you measure it or prove it? This is just a way of thinking about it, at best, a speculative theory. What's real is what we measure inside the brain through electrophysiology and so forth. Well, it occurred to me that one test of this would be that if you look at someone from behind, if your mind reaches out to touch them, then you might be able to affect someone by looking at them. And as soon as I thought about it, I realized this is an extremely common phenomenon. Most people have experienced the sense of being stared at, or Scopaesthesia, as it's now called scientifically. People have experienced their mind being more extensive than the brain through influencing others or being influenced by others' minds at a distance. This is something I've done quite a bit of research on, and I've written a book called The Sense of Being Stared At, where I discuss all the evidence and all these issues to do with the extended mind. I think our minds also extend and influence others through thoughts and intentions, as in telepathy, in telephone telepathy, which is the commonest kind in the modern world. If I'm thinking of someone I want to call them, I have, of course, an intention to call them in my mind. There's a sense in which my mind reaches out to that person, and they may start thinking about me because I'm intending to call them. And then when I do call them a little bit later, they may say, Rupert, that's funny, I was just thinking about you. Well, this kind of telephone telepathy is experienced by more than 80% of the population. And I think shows the mind is extended outwards through intention. Telepathy works with people who are closely bonded. It also works with animals. Many dogs pick up their owner's intentions to come home and start waiting for them before they arrive. That research is summarized in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. All of these are backed up by lots and lots of papers in peer-reviewed journals, which you can read on my website. Well, attention and intention are ways in which the mind stretches out into the world around us. ad tendere means to stretch towards, intendere in Latin means to stretch into. And I think our minds literally stretch out beyond our brains all the time in just ordinary waking life. And I think similar things happen with other animals as well. I think the minds of dogs, the minds of cats, the minds of horses, of birds, of all animals stretch out when they're looking at things, so their minds are extended through their senses into the world all around them. Now, when we come to the psychedelic effects, we're dealing with not just normal perception. If you take psychedelics with your eyes open in daylight, as my own preferred way of doing it is in natural settings, in daylight, then it changes the way you see colors, the way you see shapes and forms. The earth breathes, the moss on barks of trees seems to be breathing, and the bark seems to be moving. I'm sure many people here have had these kinds of experiences. So it changes your perceptual world. And also, of course, if you shut your eyes, then you have visionary experiences, primarily visual. The interesting thing about most psychedelics is that they're visual. They affect the visual sense most. There are very few that affect the auditory sense. I mean, they affect the hearing in the sense that they often produce synesthesia, producing visual effects that go with the music or other sounds that you're hearing. But most psychedelics, I mean, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, most of the main psychedelic families have very powerful visual effects. There are a few that don't. 5-methoxy-DMT is largely non-visual, but most are primarily visual. In this sense, I think what they connect us with is a realm of visual possibilities that all of us experience every day in our dreams. Dreams involve entering an altered state of consciousness, which we experience primarily visually. Dreams are about possibilities. Indeed, I think consciousness is primarily about possibilities. It's about exploring possibilities and choosing among them. And in dreams, we can have very vivid images. We can be doing things we are not doing in real life. In real life, our body's lying asleep in bed. But in our dreams, we have another body, a dream body, which can move around, even fly, see things, talk to people, do things. This is part of our normal being. I mean, children dream, babies dream, and even embryos in wombs have rapid eye movement, which is suggestive that they too are dreaming even before they're born. So dreams are very much part of our conscious world. And in modern materialistic secular societies, they're rather marginalized. They're just treated as of no particular significance. Occasionally, if people go to psychotherapists, they might find someone who's interested in their dreams. And indeed, they can reveal a great deal about the mind, as Freud and Jung and many other psychotherapists have shown. But basically, they're not taken very seriously in our world. Most people don't bother to write them down or pay much attention to them. But what dreams show is that all of us have this capacity to generate visionary states, possible realms of experience, different from our normal life, within our minds. And I myself think that psychedelics exaggerate that ability to dream. I think that psychedelic visionary experiences are continuous with dreams, as it were. They're part of the same spectrum as dreams. They're just much further along in terms of vividness and alertness and the way to pay and the ability to pay attention to them. And in our dreams, we have all sorts of encounters. We can encounter other people, we can meet people and talk to them. We can meet dead people and talk to them. I sometimes meet my parents, who are both dead, in my dreams. We can meet other kinds of beings, animals and plants and other kinds of beings altogether in our dreams. Some people dream of saints and have visions of saints, which are a special kind of dead people, ones that are particularly closely connected to God, it's believed within religious traditions. And many people see gods and goddesses in their dreams. When I got interested in this idea of collective dream consciousness, which Jung, of course, wrote a great deal about in his idea of the collective unconscious as a kind of collective memory, I got interested in whether Hindus dream of Ganesh. Ganesh is an elephant-headed god, a son of Shiva, according to Indian mythology, who couldn't possibly have existed in real life unless there were elephant head transplants, which seem extremely unlikely. So Ganesh is, in a sense, a product of the imagination, and yet Ganesh can also be a channel of divine grace, or because it doesn't have to be necessarily a real person or real object. It can come through an image. In the Eastern Orthodox churches, people have icons to help in their prayer and meditation. They're not worshipping the picture on a piece of wood, but it's acting as a channel through which some spiritual energy can flow into them. Anyway, I got interested in whether Hindus dream about Ganesh, and I discovered online there are whole Ganesh dream groups in India where groups of people are discussing their Ganesh dreams with each other. So there's a sense in which a being, Ganesh, who you could say in the most banal way is a product of the human imagination, or a cultural form, or an artistic creation, takes on a kind of collective identity for a lot of people in their dreams as well as in real life. Many people pray to Ganesh. There are statues of Ganesh in temples. People have pictures in their homes and so on. So when people are having psychedelic experiences, one of the things that my friend Terence McKenna was very interested in was people's encounters with entities. They encounter beings. Terence talked about encountering what he called machine elves on DMT in DMT trips. Lots of people encounter beings of one kind or another. Well, I don't think that these beings that people encounter in psychedelic experiences are necessarily that different from those that people encounter in dreams or in other altered states of consciousness, like shamanic trances. In some cultures, shamans take psychedelics, but in other cultures, they enter trance states through different means, chanting, drumming, and other methods of entering altered states of consciousness. They encounter animal spirits. They encounter the spirits of the departed, the ancestors. They encounter other kinds of beings. And I think that all of these are realms of experience to which we can become open in psychedelic experiences. And of course, not all these beings are friendly. All traditions speak of harmful spirits or beings. In the Islamic tradition, there are bad jinns as well as good jinns. In the Christian tradition, there are angels, spirit beings, but there are also devils who are like fallen angels, negative spiritual entities. There are, in the Tibetan tradition, there are deities, but there are also wrathful deities who can be destructive and harmful if you're doing the wrong kind of thing. So there are all these entities, a whole world out there of experience. And of course, this is a realm, this realm of dreamlike experience or altered state of consciousness experience, which is often portrayed in art. It's the basis of a lot of fantasy and fiction and artistic productions of every kind. And some cultures have cartographies of these realms. One of the major ones in the Western tradition is Dante's journey, the Divine Comedy, where he goes on a journey through the inferno down into deeper and deeper regions of hell, where he meets groups of people who are trapped in various addictions and anger and envy and various states of mind or being which imprison or trap them. And when he reaches the very bottom, he goes on, keeps going through the center of the earth and comes out the other side in the southern hemisphere, where there's a kind of mountain, Mount Purgatory. And he ascends that mountain and meets people who are getting over various things they did in life which trap them, but from which they can move on. And it's where people are moving on before moving to paradise. And these are maps of realms of consciousness, states of being, some negative, some positive, and some very positive, because at the end, in the beatific vision, at the end, there's this sort of release into this greater visionary realm of bliss. Now, all religious and spiritual traditions have the idea that beyond the world we normally experience, there are realms of consciousness that are beyond the human level, more than human realms of consciousness. As I've mentioned, realms of spirits, angels, ancestors, and saints, but also realms of ultimately the realms of divine consciousness. The traditional view is that consciousness is not confined to human brains, present only in human beings in an otherwise inanimate and purposeless universe. That is the modern materialist and atheist worldview. It couldn't be more different from the traditional worldview, which sees consciousness as kind of primary, the universe arising out of consciousness, and that consciousness still underlying everything within the universe, including our own minds, which are split off or separated off, small like droplets of ultimate consciousness, which seem separate from each other and seem separate from the ultimate source, but are not. A very common image in India is of the idea of ultimate consciousness being a bit like the moon. And if you have lots of buckets of water reflecting the moon, you see the moon in each bucket. And it looks as if there are hundreds of moons, but actually there's only one moon. It's reflected in hundreds of different containers. And the idea is that our own minds, in that way, in a similar way, are part of the divine consciousness. But we're normally so preoccupied with our own concerns, worries, fears, ruminations, etc., limited desires, that we close ourselves off from that. And the idea is that we become open to it, partly through spontaneous mystical experiences. There are many people have spontaneous experiences of connection with ultimate reality. Sometimes they happen through near-death experiences. Many people who've been in accidents or had heart attacks or who nearly die have the experience of floating out of their body, then going through a kind of tunnel into the light, where they enter a realm that's utterly blissful and loving, where they feel completely accepted, loved, connected, joyful. And yet, because it's a near-death experience, they can't stay there. They have to go back, and they arrive back in their body, and they're in an operating theatre, or people are carrying them from the scene of an accident on a stretcher or something like that, and they're suddenly in great pain. But for many people who've had near-death experiences, that experience of being part of a greater realm of consciousness than their own is completely transformative. Their lives are changed by it. And I think that many rites of passage, which occur in many cultures at the threshold of adulthood, many rites of passage involve the theme of death and rebirth. In the Native American Vision Quest, for example, young men fast and they go out into the wilderness where they spend some time alone, fasting, in danger. I mean, this is a trial by ordeal. They could die, some do, or did. And what comes to them is some kind of vision of where they should be going in life. They get a vision of where they're going, what life holds for them, what should be their mission in life, their medicine, as some Native Americans put it. And this vision quest comes about through going close to death and then having a visionary experience. I think that rites of passage are very common in many traditional cultures, and the one that's most familiar in the Christian world or post-Christian world is baptism. In the New Testament, we read that John the Baptist was baptizing people who were coming in large numbers to the River Jordan, to the place where he was baptizing them. And how he did it was he held them under the water. And when they came up, their lives in many cases were transformed. Now, this is often treated as if it were merely symbolic. But I think if we see it in a different way, it makes a lot more sense. I think what John the Baptist might have been doing was inducing near-death experiences by drowning, holding people under just long enough so that they had a near-death experience on the edge of dying by drowning. Now, he may have lost a few, especially when he was starting out, but he was very experienced by the time Jesus went there and was baptized by him. And the first thing we read about of Jesus's vision of his connection with God was through his baptism, this sense of deep connection, deep affinity with God. And that transformative experience, a rite of passage, I think certainly was symbolic of death and rebirth, but why have something that's symbolic when you can have the real thing and it takes a minute or two longer? So this, I think, was rediscovered by Baptists in the 16th and 17th century. In the early church, soon people did treat baptism as symbolic, sprinkling water over babies, or if immersing them, doing it very briefly. But in the ferment of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, a group of the most extreme group, really, of religious radicals, the Anabaptists, Ana means again, people who thought people should be baptized again, started having adult baptism through total immersion. And the people who underwent that went around saying that they'd been born again, they'd seen the light, they'd died, and they'd come to life again. It was a spiritual birth. Well, that makes total sense if this rite of passage had been inducing a near-death experience in these people. I think that psychedelic drugs can induce rites of passage for people in near-death type experiences for many people. And I think for many people today, they serve a similar role to baptism at the time of the New Testament or among Anabaptists at the time in the 16th, 17th century, and maybe till much more recently. After all, in the United States, it's the Southern Baptists who go around about being born again and seeing the light and dying and being reborn. Many of them may actually have had this kind of near-death experience. I don't know enough to have done a survey, but it would make complete sense if they had. Everything they say would make sense. Well, Stan Grof, who was one of the pioneers of LSD research in the 1960s and 70s, collected more than 2,500 accounts of LSD experiences from people. This was when it was still legal. And one of the things he noticed is that many of these accounts, people described an experience of taking LSD that was at first extremely scary. They felt constricted, imprisoned, trapped. They felt they were in a hell-like state. And actually, this is what happened when I took it myself the first time. I'd never heard of Stan Grof or his research, but I felt I was trapped in a kind of underground, underwater state, completely imprisoned. I thought I'd gone mad. I thought I'd never escape. I thought I was trapped forever. I thought I was in hell. And to prove it, neon signs with hell written on them lit up all around me. So I was trapped. Well, Stan Grof says this is a very common kind of experience. Then people find themselves going through a kind of tube or tunnel into the light. I myself had that kind of experience. A reassuring word from my companion got me out of that hell-like state, and I felt I was rising up through the water towards the surface, and then broke out of the surface of the water into light and a place of joy and peace and beauty, exquisite beauty, revelation. It was a kind of near-death experience. Well, Stan Grof says that is, in the accounts he studied, a very common and recurrent theme. Other people have had this kind of experience with DMT. And I think that, I mean, I can't ask everyone here how they've been affected, but I suspect that this is a relatively common experience as a kind of rite of passage, especially if taken with fairly high doses as an initiatory experience into psychedelics. The experience of being in that realm of joy and bliss is not unique to psychedelics, of course. It's part of the mystical experience that comes through many different kinds of spiritual practice. Psychedelics are one, but they're any one of the many ways in which we can open ourselves to the spiritual realm. In my recent books, Science and Spiritual Practices and Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, in each book, I deal with 7 different spiritual practices that have been studied scientifically and shown to have a positive effect. They make people happier, healthier, and taken together, these practices are now, through thousands of studies, shown to make people live longer as well. In other words, spiritual experiences are good for you. Spiritual practices are helpful. The corollary is that lack of spiritual practices is bad for you, probably makes you unhappier, unhealthier, and live shorter. So in this book, Science and Spiritual Practices, I discuss a number of practices, including meditation, the practice of gratitude, pilgrimage, singing and chanting, connecting with nature. And in this book, Ways to Go Beyond, I discuss further practices, including petitionary prayer, fasting, and spiritual openings through cannabis and psychedelics, and a range of other practices as well, including sports, which I think is one of the main ways in which people in the modern world enter altered states of consciousness. It's usually thought of as supremely secular, but many people have spiritual experiences through sports. So psychedelics are not the only way of entering these spiritual realms, but they're one of the quickest, and in the modern world, one of the most important ways, I think, as a rite of passage for opening up the very possibility of spiritual experiences. It certainly was for me and for many people I know. Now, there's then the question of what's actually going on here. If you talk to a materialist, and all of us have got materialist friends and acquaintances, they'll say, well, all that's happening is these molecules are interfering with the functioning of the brain. The activity of the brain changes. We know that's true because of brain scans of people on drugs. And it's all just inside the head. Well, that comes back to the contracted mind view, the official materialist worldview that says it's all inside the head. And some people who take psychedelics believe that. But most people who take them find it increasingly difficult to believe, like I did myself, and find that these experiences open them up to the idea that the mind is vastly greater than the brain, both in ordinary everyday experience through perception and, as I've talked about already, also through dreams and through the whole realm of the imagination, the imaginal realm, and also through these mystical experiences. There are some people who don't want to go as far as God in their psychedelic interpretation of their psychedelic experiences. But I think that may be partly because of a view of God shaped by atheist propaganda, where God's often portrayed as a ridiculous belief in some bearded figure seated somewhere in the sky that telescopes and the Hubble Space Telescope and so on have failed to detect and therefore doesn't exist. Actually, the view of God is, the traditional view is one as a conscious being. And I already mentioned the Hindu idea of divine consciousness underlying the universe. And it's not just an undifferentiated consciousness. Within the Hindu tradition, they speak of it as Sat, Chit, Ananda. There's three aspects to this ultimate consciousness. They're not three separate consciousnesses, but three aspects of the same consciousness. Sat is conscious being. It's the ground of being, the ground of consciousness itself. Being and consciousness go together. Ultimate being is conscious. Chit is about the contents of consciousness, that which is known. The Sat is the knower. Chit is more like that which can be known. Forms, and as the Hindus say, names and forms, nama rupa. Everything we see around us, the forms of things, plants, animals, books, tables, chairs, these are all things we can know. So are words and ideas and all the contents of our minds. Names and forms are known because there's a ground of consciousness that can know them. And one of the points of meditation is that by stilling the mind, by concentrating on a mantra or through mindfulness, looking at the effects of breathing or of awareness of the body and what's happening in and around the body, through this alternative center of consciousness, we can free ourselves from being immersed in the constant chatter of the mind, the endless flow of thoughts that go through our minds, ruminations, and which are associated with the activity of brain regions called the default mode network. Psychedelics suppress the activity of the default mode network, and so does meditation, and so do other spiritual practices. One of the reasons that sports are so effective is that if you're climbing a cliff face and you've got a drop of hundreds of feet below you, and you're looking for the next toehold or the foothold, you're totally concentrated in the present. You're not thinking and worrying about things you should have done yesterday or tomorrow. If you're in the middle of a game of football and someone's passing you the ball, you have to be completely concentrated in the present. And that's, I think, why sports can have this transformative effect on people when they're playing them, because they suppress the default mode network and bring people into the present. So the openness to this larger consciousness that can happen through spiritual practices enables us to contact different aspects of the ultimate consciousness. I think meditation opens us more to the sat of the Sat Chit Ananda aspect of ultimate consciousness. I think psychedelics and the appreciation of beautiful forms and flowers open us to the chit aspect, names and forms. Well, psychedelics are often without names, but they're, as I said earlier, highly visual. So they have much to do with exploring the realm of form and ultimate form. And Ananda, the third part of that, is joy or bliss. Very often these states are accompanied by bliss or joy. And the idea is that the divine consciousness is blissful. God is ultimately blissful, and the ultimate source of bliss. And the joy and bliss we experience through psychedelic experiences and through other mystical and spiritual experiences are because we contact this, we come into contact with or link to this ultimate consciousness, albeit relatively briefly. The Christian model of ultimate consciousness is somewhat similar. Most people don't recognize how similar it is, but I myself think it is. This is something I didn't really think about until I was living in India. I lived in the ashram of a great Benedictine teacher, Father Bede Griffiths, in South India. It was called Satchitananda Ashram in Indian, and in English, the Ashram of the Holy Trinity. Sat in the Satchitananda model is being, conscious being. And in the Christian model, this is God the Father. When he first announces himself to Moses in the Old Testament, and Moses said, "What? Who are you?" He says, "I am who I am." Conscious being in the present is the defining feature of this ultimate divine principle. Then the chit form, to do with forms, in the Christian model of the Trinity is the logos, which is rather like the Platonic forms and ideas in Greek philosophy, particularly Plato's philosophy, the names and forms of all the things that we can have in our minds or know. And the Holy Spirit is the principle of movement or flow, wind and breath and flow. And the basic model in the Hindu, in the Christian Trinity is speech. God is the speaker. And whenever you speak, as I'm speaking now, you have on the one hand a flow of breath. If there wasn't this flow of breath, my words would be inaudible. They'd be inside my mind, but you wouldn't be able to hear them. And if it wasn't for the pattern or the forms of the words that start off in my mind, that take on form or structure through the flow of breath, each word has a different form, a different vibratory pattern, then there wouldn't be any transmission of words. So I'm the speaker, there's the outward flow of breath, and there's the words that are carried by it, which have form. And that's, I think, the most fundamental metaphorical model of the ultimate nature of consciousness in this Trinitarian model. Now, of course, there are theologies that say, well, the ultimate reality is so far beyond anything we can conceive, we can't know it. In the Hindu tradition, that's called Nirguna Brahman, Brahman without qualities, beyond all we can conceive, as opposed to Saguna Brahman, Brahman with qualities. And in the Christian tradition, the Holy Trinity, the ultimate nature of God, is the way that God interfaces or manifests in the world. But beyond that, known through the deepest kinds of spiritual experiences, is what Meister Eckhart, the great medieval mystic, called the Godhead, which is like Nirguna Brahman, God beyond all qualities, form, or ability to define his nature or her nature, because once you're at that level, gender is quite meaningless. So I think that what psychedelics can do is help to open up the mind, literally mind expanding, not the only way of expanding minds, but for many people, a very important way of expanding minds. And through expanding our mind, recognizing our minds are part of vastly greater conscious realms, which include all sorts of other minds as well, beings that we can encounter in dreams, in visions, in psychedelic altered states of consciousness, which include a whole taxonomy of animal spirits, ancestors, angels, saints, jinns, demons, dakinis, and so on. I mean, there are many, many realms of being there, and also many kinds of beings in those realms. Various traditions have different taxonomies of these beings. And I think people who take psychedelics unprepared for this are often surprised that these realms are not unpopulated or just generated inside their brains, but they have a population. There are denizens of these other realms. And then ultimately, the idea that our minds are derived from a source beyond all these forms, including all these spirit beings, which sustains them all and sustains our own minds as well. Now, you can step back from that vision as much as you like. And if you're a totally committed materialist, you can say, well, it's just a trip. It's all happening inside my brain. It's all just molecules changing the way my brain works. And there are some people perfectly happy with that belief system. Well, I don't think they're perfectly happy. I think it's a fairly depressing belief system. And I think that's why the endemic problem of modern societies is depression. And I think it's also interesting that recent research on psychedelics, including psilocybin and other psychedelics, has shown that they can often help people who have addictions or depression, long-term chronic depression that's intractable to other treatments. And I think why they have that effect is because they enable people to go from their locked-in, closed-in state, which is making them so depressed, opening them to a spiritual vision, a much, much larger realm of consciousness, which has a healing effect. And that's, I think, why recovery from depression or addiction is very often associated with a spiritual path, either 12-step recovery programs, which are essentially spiritual programs opening to a spiritual realm, or through probably much quicker method through psychedelics opening to this vaster, much vaster realm of consciousness, which transforms people, just as near-death experiences transform people for the same reason. They're open to a much larger realm of consciousness. Well, that's a summary of what I wanted to say this evening. And as you see, I think that we can learn quite a lot from psychedelic experiences. We can also, of course, people do get lost. Some people are driven psychotic by them, often if they take them under the wrong kinds of conditions without proper social support or guidance, and particularly if they're prone to psychosis in the first place. I'm certainly not advocating psychedelics in the drinking water as a cure for all society's ills, but I think used responsibly and in the right kind of framework, they can be enormously helpful in our spiritual and religious journeys.
Thank you so much, Rupert, for sharing that with us, speaking on consciousness and psychedelics. We now have about 30 minutes to open up to questions. So if you have any questions, just go to the chat and type it down, and I'll just read it out to Rupert. So the first question is from Jacob Jones. Given the potential of psychedelic experiences to radically alter our worldviews, do you think that governments tend to be anti-entheogens because of this, and the likelihood that users of psychedelics will be less receptive to authoritarianism?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the governments on the whole have tended to be against psychedelics, although that is changing now. I mean, we're now seeing legal research and the use of psychedelics in medical conditions. And in some countries like Brazil, the use of psychedelics in religious contexts is not illegal. There's a psychedelic church. There are several psychedelic churches in Brazil. The best known is Santo Daime. The other one is União do Vegetal. And members of Santo Daime is a Christian church where the sacrament is ayahuasca. And this is a legal feature in Brazil. There isn't a law against it because the government treats it as religion. And religions have always been allowed to have altered states of consciousness. In medieval Europe, governments didn't try to suppress, until the Reformation, they didn't try to suppress hermitages and monasteries and convents, where there were many people spending hours and hours a day in meditative prayer and contemplative prayer, many of them reaching visionary and amazing altered states of consciousness. In India, it's traditionally been the case that rishis, seers or sages meditate in caves in the Himalayas and elsewhere. Many of them, many holy men smoke ganja or cannabis. And again, that was always part of the traditional society. So I think most, in Islamic countries, the Sufis and other groups cultivate altered states of consciousness through singing, through dancing, and through rhythmic breathing. And again, these are not things that were traditionally suppressed. I think modern secular governments, which have largely bought into the materialist worldview, see these as disruptive influences that could lead to trouble, and do seem to think that it's their duty to suppress them. But I don't think this is inherent necessarily in the nature of government, because most governments throughout most of human history have been open to religion, to spiritual states of consciousness. Although the people in government haven't necessarily practiced them themselves, they've acknowledged them. And most, I mean, it's only very recently that governments have become secular or even atheist. The Soviet Union was officially atheist, and religion was ruthlessly suppressed because materialism was the official state philosophy. But all traditional societies have religions of one sort or another, and all religions have altered states of consciousness of one sort or another. That's what religions are primarily based on, certainly in their origins. And so I think when we're talking about governments, we have to see this is not an invariable part of governments, and this could change.
Thank you, Rupert. Next question is from Gabriela. She asked, could you please elaborate on what happens biochemically in the brain at the time of actual death?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because I don't think people really know very much. There was a theory that was put about by Rick Strassman, who did research on DMT, legal research on DMT. The idea that when we die, there's a release of DMT from the pineal gland. Actually, Rick Strassman's a friend of mine, and I suggested that to him in the first place, because I myself, my PhD is in biochemistry from Cambridge, and I was working on tryptophan biochemistry in plants. When the amino acid tryptophan breaks down, it releases, among other things, the plant hormone auxin. In animals and plants, when it breaks down, it also releases tryptamine, and 5-hydroxytryptamine is a neurotransmitter in animal brains. Serotonin is its other name. And dimethyltryptamine, DMT, is a very powerful psychedelic. And these breakdown products of tryptophan are released when proteins break down, when cells die. But the effects of near-death experiences or death experiences happen very fast. there isn't really time for all the cells to start breaking down. And it may be that some neurotransmitters or even DMT, which is produced naturally in the brain, can be produced and may account for some of the near-death experiences. But I'm not a chemical reductionist. I think that there's no need for us to try and force all these experiences into a kind of psychedelic mold where we've endogenous psychedelics produced in the brain might help to explain some of these experiences during death, but they might not. I think it's an open question. And, you know, in dying brains, again, there's it's a reversible process. As we know from near-death experiences, people can have astonishingly intense near-death experiences, and their brain can be flatlined for minutes, but can't be too long before they're brought back to life if they're resuscitated. Otherwise, there's irreversible brain damage. But you can have intense near-death experiences without irreversible brain damage. So it's not dependent on the whole brain breaking down and decaying these experiences. So I just don't know. There haven't been that many studies of dying brains. And so there isn't that much known. But I mean, it's certainly an interesting question.
Thank you. Next question is from Astroflower Tara. Taking into account the changing morphic fields within people, all animals, and vegetation on this planet, this is also noticeable across the solar system. Does this have an effect on shamanic activities and human evolution? Should technology adapt to the human consciousness rather than like Elon Musk adapting human to technology? What developments in consciousness and technology will the future hold?
Well, that's a pretty far-ranging question. Well, I certainly am no Elon Muskite, and I'd be perfectly happy if Elon Musk and his friends do emigrate to the moon and stay there. I think that one of the things that technologies have done for human consciousness is precisely through the invention of psychedelics. I mean, LSD is a synthetic compound based on a fungal product, lysergic acid in ergot. But I think we can, I think we've already got a huge drug industry for legal drugs of every kind. And I think that the psychedelics can play a socially transformative role. I'm slightly ambiguous about legalizing them, though, because as soon as they're legalized, then large corporations will try to patent them. And as happened with legalization of cannabis, there's now enormous corporations and sort of the cottage industry of home growers and small scale operations is being wiped out by vast industrial concerns. And I think it would be a great shame if that happened to psychedelics. I think that in terms of evolution of consciousness, I think one of the great challenges comes more for religion than for science. Religions are all based on altered states of consciousness, ultimately. The Buddha didn't become enlightened through doing a PhD. He became enlightened through meditating for years under Bodhi trees and elsewhere. Jesus didn't become aware of his divine mission through going to a rabbinical seminary, although he was well versed in the Old Testament. It happened through his rite of passage through baptism by John the Baptist, a kind of near-death experience, and then 40 days fasting in the wilderness, a retreat, a vision quest, and then spending a lot of time praying in the hills and the mountains. So I think that the religions need to recover that spiritual and visionary dimension, which I think they had and still have. And for example, here in England, we have all our wonderful cathedrals. which I think were buildings designed in the Middle Ages to create altered states of consciousness. Gigantic buildings with stained glass windows, with psychedelic type stained glass windows. These buildings are not mere functional structures, for they're huge soaring heights, echoing vaults, beautiful sculptures. These are designed to produce altered states of consciousness. And it's not all about reading things in books, it's about experience. There's a movement I think is a really interesting movement in Britain at the moment called Cathedrals on Cannabis. Many people have found visiting our great cathedrals under the influence of cannabis is a really transformative and enlightening experience. There are some people visit them under the influence of modest doses of magic mushrooms and other mind-altering substances. And I think this is a very good way of connecting with a visionary tradition that's actually part of our own tradition, is right here in modern England. These buildings designed to alter our consciousness will do it if we let them. I think that one of the challenges for religions is to bring back the experiential dimension. And Santo Daime, this psychedelic church in Brazil, is one model for that. So I think that we're not only do we need an evolution of technology, I think we need an evolution of religion as well. And I think that if the Santo Daime people led retreats, for example, as people already do lead mushroom retreats in Holland and elsewhere, I think that this could be very valuable. They could be rather like going on a religious or spiritual retreat. Well, they would be going on a religious or spiritual retreat with people who are experienced in guiding this process. So I think actually the thing that's least developed about the modern world is consciousness and the study of consciousness. And it doesn't necessarily require lots of technology. Brain scans and so forth are helpful in studying what happens in brains, but actually most psychedelic research doesn't need all that paraphernalia and can be done much more cheaply through actually studying experience directly. That's what consciousness is about, experience. And we've had a period in science, particularly in the 20th century with behaviorism, when the aim of psychology and behaviorism was to eliminate experience entirely, make psychology objective, measuring only muscular movements and glandular secretions. But consciousness is experience. And so if we eliminate experience from science, we end up with an incredibly unbalanced view of nature. And that's what we've got in mechanistic materialism, which is very good for producing machines and technologies, but terrible for human living in the world and living in harmony with nature. So I think consciousness research is not necessarily technology research, is what could really help us all. And development and evolution of religion, as well as technology and social and the organization of society is what we really need, taking into account the fact we have to change the way we live if we're going to go on surviving on this planet.
Next question is from Annie, and she asks, have you heard reports of or experienced group telepathy during group psychedelic experiences? For example, seeing the same entities or the same information being conveyed. If psychedelics are mind extending, could they enhance extension within a group?
That's a very good question. And I think probably, so I haven't heard of any studies of this kind, because most of the studies that are going on now, official studies, are medicalized uses of psychedelics for treating depression and addiction. And people in our modern world, highly individualist, people are treated as individuals, not as groups. So the official research, as far as I know, is not looking at this aspect. But there are people who've done research on dream groups, who find that groups of people who share their dreams together and have bonding experiences together do have shared dreams. They can meet each other in their dreams, for example, and they can tell they can write down their dreams, then they find that similar things have happened. They actually have met in their dreams. One person's dream corresponds to another person's dream. They have overlapping dreams. And if that happens with dreams, given the similarity between dreams and psychedelic experiences, I would imagine it would happen through group psychedelic experiences as well. Places where people take psychedelics in groups would be the first place to look. I myself believe in doing inexpensive research, starting with the natural history of phenomena rather than fancy research involving lots of machinery. Where I'd look if I were looking at this question would be in ceremonies of the Native American Church among Native Americans, where they take peyote ceremonially as a group, and in Santo Daime ceremonies where whole groups take ayahuasca together as part of a unified group, which is kept unified through singing together and dancing together. And so there are already group psychedelic experiences that are happening in these cultures. And if I were launching a project to answer that question, that's where I'd start. Simply ask them, have they had this experience or have they noticed it? If they haven't noticed it, ask them if they could look out for it and see whether this does in fact happen. I wouldn't mind betting it does. As I say, it would be much easier to start from where people already are than to try and get government permission to set up research groups in Imperial College or somewhere else here in Britain and go through years and years of filling in forms and stuff. Don't need to do that. Can just go straight to where people are already, or maybe already doing it.
Okay, the next question is from Part, and he asked, do you think there is an experience, for example, after DMT or psilocybin, that after going through it, even hardcore materialists will start to doubt if there's something outside their worldview?
Well, again, this is an empirical question, and people who've done surveys of hardcore materialists who've taken these substances find that many of them do change their worldview. There was one study I read recently where quite a number of people who took part in the study were atheists and materialists to start with, and by the time they'd digested this experience, very few of them were still atheists and materialists. Atheists are people, of course, who believe there's no consciousness out there beyond the human level, or some of them, I suppose, might be cosmic atheists and think there's consciousness in the entire cosmos, but there's nothing beyond. But that would be more like pantheism than atheism. So I suspect that in many cases, people's worldviews are changed from atheism and materialism. Certainly, that was my own experience. And I know many other people who've had that experience. So I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing quite a major social transformation going on in Europe and North America at the moment. I think that the spread of psychedelic experience, which has been going on since the 1960s, really, it was underground for a long period, it's a bit less underground now, is having this socially transformative effect.
Thank you, Rupert. And next question is from Mutze, and he asks, you mentioned Terence McKenna. He said about the current situation of our society and about our point in history as a whole, that we are in a state of transition. He compared it to the process of birth, which you mentioned in your talk. So if we are, as humanity, are in the birth canal, how can we ease the pains and traumas that we see all over the world? And what can we do to not lose faith that there is something beyond?
Well, again, this is a really complicated question. Well, it's not complicated in the sense that there are a lot of people who have spiritual experiences both within and outside religious frameworks, through spiritual practices, including psychedelics, who feel that we are connected to something far greater than ourselves, and that humanity is about much more than just gross national product and ever greater consumption, and bigger and better everything. So I think there are plenty of people who already know that. The question is, how do we actually express that through political and economic and social realities? There are clearly strong forces working against this. There's the tremendous inertia of the economic system with all the vested interests. There's the fact that now many people in the world have been converted to consumerism. People were not consumerist in traditional societies. Now they are. And then there's all the sort of usual social and economic problems and rising population, environmental degradation, climate change, and so on. Well, I think that if we have a spiritual vision and connect to a sense of really hope that things can change and imagine things better, that's part of the answer. Despair, which literally means lack of hope, means we just give up. And if everyone gives up, things will inevitably get worse. It's self-fulfilling. If we hope that they can be better and we try and imagine how things can be better, the imagination is the first step. You have to imagine how it could be better to then try and make it better and find ways of bringing these imaginations into practice. And actually, I'm not totally in a state of despair at all. I think that faulty though the COP26 climate summit was, there's now a wider recognition in the world, including among people in power, that we're in trouble. Humanity and the planet are in trouble thanks to our habits and our activities, and we need to do something about it. Decarbonizing the economy is now mainstream government policy in many countries. And, 30 or 40 years ago, that might have seemed a forlorn hope. So things do change. And I think we have to acknowledge that many people recognize the need for change. And I think part of the problem is we've still got a scientific orthodoxy which is locked into a dogmatic materialism. If you study science at school or university, you're still getting old school materialism taught almost without qualification, as if this is scientific truth. And of course, it puts off a lot of students from science, not surprisingly, because it's a very depressing and narrow worldview. And most people who study science, or many of them, certainly in countries like India or China, don't do it because of a deep curiosity about nature. They do it because it holds the key to a good job as an engineer or as a research scientist. They're doing it because it is a way of earning a living. But my own particular struggle is with this scientific orthodoxy, which is totally committed still to a dogmatic materialist worldview. And some of you may have seen my book, The Science Delusion, where I take the 10 dogmas of materialism that are the foundations of the modern scientific worldview and show how science itself has gone beyond them, and that we're actually passing beyond a materialist worldview, but many people within science and outside science don't yet realize it. So I think that's part of it. It's not the whole answer, of course, but as long as we have at the center of our educational system and public life a false view of nature and a false view of human nature, then, and one that sets us at odds with the environment and with the natural world and the more than human world, then it's bound to be disastrous because it's so false. It gives such an unbalanced view. It gives a view of ourselves as the conquerors of nature, the ability to use natural resources however we see fit for human good and human good alone. As the primary objective of economic and political systems, the profit and ever rising incomes and the goal of business is to make more and more profit all the time. These narrow goals obviously need to be transcended. But if we have a worldview that has nothing but material realities in them and nothing but quantitative material realities, then quantifying progress in terms of money and gross domestic product and so on, and seeing the whole universe as material and us as merely material beings is obviously contributing to the problems. And we need to move beyond that.
Thank you, Rupert. The next question is actually from me, and feel free to comment on my question. So it does seem to me that there is this notion of better qualified judges of reality, not people that will determine what reality is, but there is this idea of qualification. And what I can see is that a lot of materialists may just be experiencing the waking state and the dream state of consciousness, and perhaps some subtleties, of the flow states and some things in that range. But don't you think there is a kind of a philosophical principle that a community of people who have had more states of consciousness, they're a more qualified community to give judgments on reality, not to say that the judgment is right and accurate, but just to say that, for example, the community of Hindu mystics and shamans, that community is more better qualified because of the fact that they have experienced a wide variety of states of consciousness than the community of materialists who may have not had those experiences. Is there not like a philosophical principle that one is a better judge, a more qualified judge of reality than the other? By some, I mean the community, because I don't want to lead to solipsism. So yeah.
Well, this is a very long-standing debate, Ali, of course. I mean, Plato dealt with it in his Republic, where he has the philosopher king. And the idea that society would be best run if those who, the philosophers, those with the deepest view and understanding of reality, run the society. But then that raised the problem that he himself raised, quis custodet custodes, who guards the guardians. And then you have the sorry history of theocracies of various kinds, where people try to put into practice exactly the principles that you've mentioned. I suppose one of the, in recent history, probably the last great theocracy, apart from your own country, Iran, is Tibet. And the ruler of Tibet until the Chinese invaded was the Dalai Lama. And Tibet was ruled by a succession of beings, enlightened beings, lamas, and not just the Dalai Lama, but a range of other lamas, the Panchen Lama and others, who formed the government of Tibet. And these were people who'd not only undergone great spiritual training in this life, but also were believed to be reincarnations of previous spiritual teachers and masters. And, one of the Chinese criticisms of this is that the Tibetan society was a feudal society where mired in poverty and superstition, and poor people were exploited and so forth, and leading lives of, fairly wretched lives. It may be that they had great spiritual vision, but the track record of theocracies is not terribly impressive. If one actually looks at examples across the world in all different traditions, and in Europe in the Middle Ages, the popes in a way represented the main spiritual power, and again, it was clearly corruptible and corrupted in various times in the Middle Ages, which is one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant reformers then tried to have societies governed by elders who were wise and spiritual, in Calvinist societies in Geneva, in Scotland, through the Presbyterian Church. But again, this often led to forms of oppression and narrowness and dogmatism. So I don't think there's any terribly easy answer. And people who've had visionary experiences are not necessarily very good at sort of designing, educational systems or schools or businesses or tax systems or healthcare systems or hospitals. Or I mean, sometimes they are. And in the Middle Ages in Europe, all these things, schools, universities, hospitals, were run by religious orders, monks and nuns, who did a very good job in many ways. And modern secular Europe and America has inherited these institutions, which were all done by religious orders in the first place. So I think, if one looks through history, there are good examples and bad examples of the principle you've raised. And even when you have nominally spiritual people in charge, as in some of the medieval popes or Renaissance popes, they can easily be corrupted, which is the point Plato raised of, if you're going to have these philosopher kings, who's going to keep them on track and how's it going to be done? So I don't think there's any simple answer that history's thrown up for this one. And for running societies, the practical skills needed for running politics and being a wise statesman or stateswoman are not necessarily the same qualities that would be there in a spiritual teacher.
Thank you, Rupert. Just a quick point, which was that I didn't mean judges in terms of like being in a position of authority. I just mean in terms of, as people, if you are to put our trust in, let's say, the community of materialists who've only experienced a certain state of consciousness, and versus a community of mystics, who do we put our trust in based on their experiences? Not to say that anyone being in a state of authority and telling everyone you have to believe this, or there are certain principles you have to follow. Just simply for us and the average person, don't you think that community of mystics, because of the range of altered states that they've had, they're better qualified in terms of what they assert about the nature of reality? Not to say that they're right, it's just more trustworthy in that sense. Yeah, just to clarify.
Well, then I could clarify also. Yes, I do think that, and I think that that's what religious traditions at their best offer us. I mean, here in Britain, most people are non-religious or post-Christian, if they came from Christian families originally. But we still have a church, we still have cathedrals, we still have parish churches. I myself am an Anglican, a practicing Christian, and I find the discipline of, I go to church on Sundays. I love singing with my local community. I like going to holy places. I go on pilgrimages to cathedrals. And I find the Christian mystics and Christian spiritual teachers really helpful. I also find Sufi spiritual teachers and Hindu spiritual teachers really helpful. But the advantage of a religious tradition is that it can build a community where people can share festivals and rites of passages. Whereas if we have a purely pick and mix individual spirituality, it doesn't build community, and it's much harder to maintain traditions. And I think that the traditions of festivals, and like in the Christian tradition, the festival of All Souls Day and All Saints Day, the Day of the Dead, the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels, September the 29th, the Feast of Candlemas, which we've recently had, February the 2nd. These, Easter and Christmas, of course, these festivals enable communities to be bound together, connected with their ancestors who celebrated the same festivals. Morphic resonance, which I haven't talked about this evening, but is a way of connecting through rituals with those who've gone before. It connects us across time as well as to communities in space. And all religious traditions originally come from mystical insights and spiritual teachers, and they can be degraded and people can forget the spiritual and they can become more routine, and they can become dogmatic, but they're continually renewed. All religions have continually renewed themselves by this spiritual tradition and insight. And I think that's what we need today. And it doesn't have to happen through established religions, but personally, I find it really helpful to work within that framework, even though I spent years as an atheist. And I find this largely because of the communities, the tradition, and the holy places.
We've gone 2 minutes past the time. I don't know if there's enough time for one more question.
Okay, let's have one more.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is from Gabriela. She asks, besides the use of psychedelics, what kind of practices and books do you suggest to improve one's ability to dream?
Well, I haven't offhand got there are several very helpful books I've read. One book that I find particularly helpful myself is a book called An Experiment with Time by J.W. Dunne, D-U-N-N-E. It's written long ago, almost 100 years ago. What Dunne found was that if he wrote down his dreams, kept a record of his dreams, that he found that he was dreaming about things that happened in the next 2 or 3 days. What he discovered is that, because he got other people to do this, and I did his exercises myself, and I found the same, that we normally in our dreams are experiencing not only memories of things that have happened, we're experiencing things that are not personal at all, what Jung would call archetypes of the collective unconscious. But we can also experience things that haven't yet happened, sometimes a vivid flash of something that happens 2 or 3 days later. There's a precognitive element to dreams. Most of us don't notice that because we don't write our dreams down. We forget them very easily, forget most of them. So one thing is writing them down, which makes one more aware of them and more aware of the way they connect us with our own lives and the future and the past. Another practice, of course, and there are several books on this, is of lucid dreaming, where you can become aware during your dream of the fact you're dreaming. And then the dream becomes more controllable. You can go where you want, and you can do what you want. You can fly if you want to. And the practice of lucid dreaming is something you can practice, you can improve at. I only very occasionally have lucid dreams, but some people, through doing lucid dream practices, Charles Morley wrote a book on this, which about dream yoga, you can get better at it. And then that means the dream state, instead of being just random dreams that happen to you, as it were, is something where you can become much more present in your dreams. In the Tibetan tradition, many Tibetan monks practice lucid dreaming, which they call dream yoga, because they believe that when we die, we go on dreaming, as it were. And if you practice lucid dreaming, instead of being confused in the after-death state, you're much more able to know what's happening and to deal with it and to navigate your way through the after-death condition. And this actually raises a very general point, perhaps an appropriate one for the last question of the evening, that these realms of consciousness we explore in dreams and in psychedelic states may continue after we're dead. I personally think that when we die, we lose the ability to wake up, but we don't lose the ability to dream. It's as if we can go on dreaming, but we can no longer wake up because we haven't got a physical body to wake up in. And post-mortal survival, which almost all religions believe in one way or another, may be a kind of continuation in the dream state. And of course, the kind of dreams you have after you're dead depend on the kind of person you are, what you believe, what you expect, what you've experienced, and, as the Tibetans would argue, the practice you've had in this life of navigating the dream realm. And many religious experiences occur in dreams. In the Bible, many of the visions that occur to Abraham and to other figures in the Bible occur in dreams. a lot of the Bible is about dream states. And, these are taken seriously in all traditions. And I think that when you see the afterlife in terms of some kind of dream-like state, then practicing dreams, paying attention to dreams, exploring these dreamlike realms more consciously through psychedelic experiences, all become very relevant, not only to this life, but also to the next. And it's not, I don't personally believe that we go on in a kind of indefinite dreamlike state forever. I think that we may pass through a transitional period of spiritual development after we're dead, and we may eventually end at a state where we enter a kind of spiritual state of bliss, like a mystical experience that in this life lasts only a short time. We may reach the state where that becomes like a permanent condition, and we become part of ultimate blissful consciousness. And a kind of transition through a dream type journey after we die may be part of that. And therefore paying attention to dreams and practicing our awareness in dreams while we're alive may be a very good thing to do.
Thank you so much, Rupert, for sharing your time with us in this evening. And thank you all for coming to the Oxford Psychedelic Society and joining us to speak on consciousness and the psychedelic experience. Thank you all for listening.